My name is Emily. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I'm a professional woman, a wife, at least I was, and someone people often mistake for being passive simply because I don't raise my voice. I've learned that when you're calm, people project simplicity onto you. When you're quiet, they assume you're not paying attention. I've never been dramatic. I don't believe in public breakdowns or revenge monologues. This isn't a story about winning or losing, and it's not about painting anyone as a villain. It's about noticing what happens when someone underestimates you for a very long time, and what shifts when you stop correcting that misunderstanding. I want to be clear from the start. I'm not telling this story to humiliate anyone, including my former husband. I'm telling it because silence has a memory, and because emotional truth doesn't need volume to be sharp. What you're about to hear is honest, restrained, and uncomfortable in the way real life often is. This story begins long before the moment most people would expect. Not with an argument, not with betrayal exposed in a dramatic scene. It begins with a small, administrative email, one that was never meant to reach me first. I found out about the divorce before he told me, through a lawyer's email. The subject line said asset division, and my name was already listed. No warning, no conversation. Just a quiet assumption that I would fall into place, as I always had. But this isn't a story about that email alone. It's about the years leading up to it, the way I was seen, the role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it, and the subtle ways respect can erode while everyone insists everything is fine. It's about what happens when you realize that being agreeable has slowly turned you invisible, and how reclaiming yourself doesn't require confrontation, only clarity. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through how I was perceived, how I learned to normalize being dismissed, and how silence, once a reflex, became a deliberate choice. You'll hear about preparation that looked like inaction and decisions made without theatrics. There are no shouting matches here, no courtroom dramatics, just cause, effect, and the calm inevitability of consequences. If you're looking for rage, you won't find it. If you're expecting a triumphant revenge arc, this won't satisfy you. What I can promise is something quieter, and I think more unsettling. A story about emotional justice that arrives without announcement, about dominance that doesn't need to prove itself, about what changes when you stop explaining who you are to people who never really listened. I'm sharing this for anyone who's ever been underestimated because they were calm, or mistaken for weak because they were patient. And before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently and honestly, have you ever sensed something ending long before anyone said the words out loud? To most people, I was easy to define. I was the reliable one. The woman who remembered birthdays without reminders, who handled paperwork without being asked, who showed up 5 minutes early and stayed 5 minutes late. In group settings, I was the one people nodded at approvingly, but rarely asked questions of, as if my presence was functional rather than personal, useful but not central. To my husband, I think I was something similar. Dependable, predictable, a background constant. He used to say, "You're the calm in my life." And at first I took that as a compliment. Calm sounds like trust. Calm sounds like safety. It took me years to understand that calm can also mean unchallenging, that it can slowly turn into something unnoticed. I wasn't ignored in obvious ways. There were no cruel jokes, no public dismissals. That's what made it harder to name. It was subtler than that. Decisions were made without looping me in. Plans are announced as conclusions rather than conversations. Financial choices framed as already handled. Not malicious, just habitual, as if my agreement was assumed by default. In social situations, I was often introduced last. "This is Emily," he'd say, after listing his work, his achievements, his current stressors. People smiled politely, they always did. I smiled back. I asked questions, I listened. I became, without meaning to, a container for other people's narratives. And I didn't protest. Not because I didn't notice, but because I didn't yet understand the cost of being perpetually accommodating. I believed that consistency would eventually earn visibility. That loyalty would translate into consideration. That if I remained steady enough, someone would eventually pause and look more closely. But invisibility doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as harmony. I was the wife who didn't mind. Didn't mind staying in, didn't mind adjusting my schedule, didn't mind managing logistics because I was better at that stuff anyway. People said this kindly, as if competence were a favor I was doing for myself, as if being capable meant I required less care. At work, it was similar. I was trusted with systems, not spotlight. Execution, not credit. When something went wrong, I was looped in immediately. When something went right, it simply became the new expectation. No one doubted my reliability. They just stopped noticing my presence as something that needed acknowledgement. And here's the part that matters most. I helped build that version of myself. I reinforced it every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I smoothed over discomfort instead of naming it. Every time I chose internal balance over external correction. I thought I was being mature, emotionally intelligent, above the need for validation. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly training the people around me on how little they needed to consider me. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being depended on but not consulted, from being trusted with responsibility but not invited into the agency. You don't feel abused, you feel assumed. And assumptions are harder to challenge than accusations because they're rarely spoken aloud. If someone had asked me then whether I felt disrespected, I would have said no. Honestly, I would have said, "We're good, we don't fight, we're stable." Stability, I believed, was the highest achievement of adulthood. But stability without mutual awareness is just inertia. I don't tell this part of the story with bitterness. There's no satisfaction in realizing you've been quietly shrinking to fit the expectations placed on you. There's only clarity, arriving late, but unmistakably. Back then, I was still trying to be seen by being easier. I hadn't yet understood that people rarely look harder when things run smoothly. They look away. And I let them. I can pinpoint the moment now, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so easy to dismiss at the time. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, light coming in through the window, coffee going cold between us. He was scrolling through his phone, half listening, while I explained a scheduling conflict I had coming up at work. I'd been asked to lead a short-term project, temporary but visible. It meant I'd need to travel for 2 weeks. He didn't look up when he said, "That's going lean sentencing away." The first small cut wasn't the decision itself. It was the assumption. The way my opportunity became a logistical inconvenience before it was ever allowed to be mine. He didn't ask what the project meant to me, didn't ask how I felt about it, just moved straight to problem solving, as if the problem was already agreed upon. I remember pausing just long enough for him to notice. He glanced up then, briefly. "What?" he asked, not unkindly. "Nothing," I said. And that was the cut. Not his words, but my response to them. Because I had noticed. My body had registered it before my mind caught up. That quiet tightening in the chest, the sense of something being brushed aside too quickly. But I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to derail a peaceful morning over something that could be framed as practical. So I reframed it myself. "He's just thinking ahead. He didn't mean it that way. We can talk about it later." Later never came. Instead, the moment folded itself into our routine, neat and unresolved. The trip happened. He adjusted, reluctantly. I made sure everything was organized in advance, so there would be no stress, no friction. I apologized more than necessary. I returned home feeling strangely smaller than when I'd left, even though the project had gone well. No one else noticed anything was off. Friends thought we were solid, functional, balanced. I thought so too, mostly. But something had shifted, just a fraction. Like a hairline crack you only see when the light hits it just right. After that, similar moments started to stack up. Conversations where my opinions were acknowledged but not acted on. Plans that seemed mutual until they weren't. Jokes, light, forgettable ones, about how I was low drama and easy to manage. People laughed. I smiled. I told myself I was overthinking. That's how normalization begins. Not with cruelty, but with convenience. What hurt wasn't that he disagreed with me. It was then that he stopped checking with me. He trusted that I would adapt, that I always did. And because I did, he learned he didn't have to slow down. Looking back, I can see how that first small cut set the tone. It taught both of us something. He learned that my silence meant consent. I learned that speaking up felt like creating tension, and I'd been trained to avoid that at all costs. I didn't confront him. I didn't journal about it. I didn't even name it. I simply absorbed it, the way you absorb background noise until you forget what quiet used to sound like. And that's the most dangerous part of subtle disrespect. It doesn't announce itself as harm. It disguises itself as efficiency, as reasonableness, as love that just happens to be a little rushed. If someone had told me then that this moment mattered, I would have laughed. It seemed too small to be significant, too ordinary. But small cuts don't heal when they're ignored. They just teach you where you're expected not to flinch. I didn't flinch. I adjusted. I accommodated. I stayed calm. And in doing so, I unknowingly marked the place where the story truly began to change. Normalization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in quietly, like dust. One day you notice it on the shelf. The next you realize it's everywhere. But by then, it feels pointless to clean. After that Sunday morning, nothing worsened in any obvious way. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums. If anything, things stayed smooth. Too smooth. And that was the problem. Smoothness became the proof that whatever I was feeling didn't need attention. I began to notice a pattern, small enough to dismiss individually, but consistent enough to feel familiar. He would decide, then inform. I would listen, then adjust. He would move forward assuming alignment. I would backfill the agreement where none had been requested. If I hesitated, he'd say, "I thought you'd be okay with it." If I questioned timing, he'd respond, "You're usually flexible." If I expressed uncertainty, he'd reassure me, "You always land on your feet." Each sentence sounded like a compliment. Each one carried the same message. You don't need to be consulted because you'll adapt. And I did. I told myself I was choosing peace, that not every disagreement deserved airtime. Those relationships required compromise, and I was simply better at it. I had vocabulary for all of it. Emotional intelligence, secure attachment, maturity. I used those words like padding, softening the impact of what was slowly being lost. I also learned how to edit myself in real time. I'd start to say something, then calculate whether it was worth the effort, whether it would change anything, whether it would be received as reasonable or disruptive. Most of the time, I'd stop mid-thought and replace it with something lighter, a nod, "that makes sense," "we'll figure it out." And here's the uncomfortable truth. I became very good at disappearing. Not physically, I was still there, still present, still functioning, but emotionally I shrank my footprint. I took up less space in conversations. I made fewer requests. I framed my needs as suggestions instead of statements. I learned to be efficient with my desires, the way you are when you don't expect them to be prioritized. No one told me to do this. No one demanded it. That's what made it so hard to push back against. There was no clear injustice to point to, just a growing imbalance that thrived on politeness. When friends asked how we were, I said, "Good." And it was true, in the way a room can be clean but airless. When my mother asked if I was happy, I paused longer than necessary before answering. I told her yes, I meant that I wasn't unhappy. At the time, that felt close enough. I remember one evening in particular. We were talking about the future, casually, abstractly. He spoke in plural pronouns. We should move closer to my work. We might downsize. We could simplify. I listened, nodded, and offered logistical thoughts. He spoke with certainty. I spoke with caution. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized I was planning a life that no longer felt authored by me. I noticed it. I named it privately. And then I did what I'd learned to do best. I rationalized it. This is what long-term relationships look like. Someone has to be the steady one. You're strong enough to handle it. Strength became my excuse, not his. I didn't want to believe I was being sidelined. That felt dramatic. So I chose a softer explanation, that this was simply adulthood, that autonomy gives way to partnership, that visibility is less important than stability. But the cost of that belief was cumulative. Every time I swallowed a reaction, it taught my nervous system that being agreeable was safer than being honest. Every time I let a decision stand without input, it reinforced the idea that my voice was optional, and slowly my silence stopped feeling like a choice. It became the default. The most unsettling part is that no one seemed to notice. Not him, not our friends, not even me, at least, not fully. Because normalization works best when it convinces you that nothing is wrong. But something was. I just didn't have the language for it yet. I don't remember anyone ever asking me to take on the role I eventually inhabited. There was no conversation, no agreement. It simply formed around me, shaped by repetition and reward. I was the reliable one, the organizer, the emotional buffer, the person who made things work quietly in the background so others could move freely in the foreground. And because I performed that role well, it hardened into expectation. In our marriage, this meant I handled the invisible labor: calendars, insurance, travel details, remembering which forms needed to be signed and which conversations needed to happen. He trusted me with all of it, which sounded like respect, until I realized trust had replaced participation. When decisions came up, I was consulted on logistics, not direction. I was asked how things could happen, and rarely whether they should. I became support staff in my own life, and the more competent I appeared, the less room there seemed to be for my uncertainty. People expect less explanation from those who seem to have it together. They don't check in as often. They assume consent. I internalized that assumption. At some point, I noticed that when something went wrong, the question wasn't what happened, but Emily, can you fix this? I had become synonymous with resolution, with cleanup. By making discomfort disappear, there's a quiet flattery in being needed. It can mask erosion for a long time. In social circles, the role extended outward. I was the reasonable wife, the one who didn't make a fuss, the one other person's partners were compared to. "You're lucky," they'd say to him. "She's so easygoing." He'd smile. I would too. I didn't know how to say that ease isn't the same as equality. What no one saw was the cost of being perpetually agreeable. How much internal editing does it require? How much energy goes into anticipating needs that are never reciprocated? How exhausting it is to be the emotional thermostat for everyone else's comfort. I wasn't angry. That's important. Anger would have been easier to recognize. I was something quieter, diminished, but functional. Resentment hadn't arrived yet. Just a low-grade ache I couldn't locate. The role came with rules, though they were unspoken. I wasn't supposed to disrupt momentum. I wasn't supposed to need reassurance. I wasn't supposed to change my mind too late in the process. Most of all, I wasn't supposed to surprise anyone. Predictability became my currency, and I paid with my complexity. I began to see myself the way others did, as someone who could be counted on, but not necessarily considered. Someone whose emotional steadiness meant she didn't require emotional inquiry. I told myself this was a compliment. That meant I was strong. But strength, when it's exploited, stops being empowering. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in during moments of quiet, standing in line at the grocery store, brushing my teeth at night, listening to him talk about plans that already seemed decided. I'd catch myself thinking, when did I agree to this? And then immediately dismiss the question because the answer felt inconvenient. I didn't yet know how to step out of the role without causing disruption. And disruption felt like failure. So I stayed inside it, performed it well, polished it until it looked like a choice instead of conditioning. But roles that are assigned without consent eventually demand a reckoning. I just didn't know yet what form that reckoning would take. The day something shifted wasn't loud. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a sharp sentence. In fact, if you'd been watching from the outside, you would have seen nothing at all. It was an ordinary weekday evening. I came home later than usual, dropped my bag by the door, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. The room was dim, the kind of quiet that settles after a long day when you don't have the energy to narrate it to someone else. He was in the living room, on a call, laughing lightly, comfortable. I recognized that laugh. The one he used when everything felt handled. I stood there longer than necessary. Not because I was listening, but because I didn't feel the urgency I used to feel. The reflex to step in, to check if something needed my attention, was absent. And that absence startled me. I realized I was tired in a way rest wouldn't fix. Later, after the call ended, he asked about my day. I gave a summary, efficient, factual. He nodded, distracted, already half elsewhere. And for the first time, I didn't try to bridge the gap. I didn't elaborate. I didn't soften the edges of my silence. I just let the space exist. That was the shift. Not anger, not sadness. Detachment, not cold but clear. A subtle internal click, like something locking into place after being loose for too long. I went to bed early that night, not to escape, but to be alone with my thoughts. I lay there staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to ask questions without immediately answering them away. What do I actually want? When was the last time I felt consulted, not accommodated? If nothing changed, could I live like this indefinitely? The answers didn't come as sentences. They came as sensations. A heaviness in my chest, a quiet certainty that surprised me with its steadiness. I wasn't invisible because I was unseen. I was invisible because I had learned to disappear. That realization didn't make me emotional. It made me focused. The next morning, nothing outwardly changed. I made coffee. I went to work. I responded to emails. I listened in meetings. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I stopped framing my experience through his comfort. I stopped editing my perceptions to maintain equilibrium. I began observing instead, not him, us, the structure, the dynamics, the patterns I'd previously justified. I noticed how often decisions were presented as faits accompli, how my agreement was assumed, not requested, how silence moved things forward more efficiently than dialogue ever had. And I noticed something else, how much information I actually had access to. I had always been close to the details, the finances, the schedules, the documents, not because I demanded control, but because I'd been assigned responsibility. I knew where things were, I knew how things worked. That awareness landed differently now. I didn't confront him, I didn't withdraw affection, I didn't change my tone. That would have drawn attention, and attention wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was clarity, so I stayed exactly the same on the surface, calm, cooperative, present. But underneath, I was no longer trying to be understood. I was trying to understand. And that distinction changed everything, because when you stop asking to be seen and start seeing clearly, you regain something you didn't realize you'd lost: agency. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that prepares quietly. That night in the dark kitchen wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something internal and irreversible. A shift from endurance to intention, from habit to choice. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity, but I knew I wouldn't unlearn it. After that night, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, a way to smooth, to preserve, to avoid friction. Now it was deliberate, measured. I spoke when it mattered to me, not when it was expected of me. And that subtle shift went completely unnoticed. That's the strange thing about silence when people are used to it from you. They don't hear the difference. I stopped volunteering information. Not in a dramatic way, just small omissions. I no longer narrated my internal process aloud. I answered questions directly, without padding them with reassurance. I didn't offer solutions unless I was asked. At first, it felt unnatural, like stepping out of a role without changing costumes. But over time, it became grounding. I noticed how often I'd previously rushed to fill pauses that weren't mine to manage. He didn't comment on the change. Why would he? From his perspective, everything still worked. Dinners happened. Schedules aligned. Life remained efficient. My quiet had always been part of the machinery. Others misread it, too. At work, colleagues interpreted my restraint as composure, authority even. When I spoke less in meetings, people leaned in more when I did speak. When I stopped preemptively fixing things, issues were suddenly taken more seriously. That was my first confirmation that silence, when chosen, has weight. At home, the effect was subtler. He filled the space more, talked through his thoughts aloud, made decisions faster. He didn't realize he was now operating without feedback. He'd been doing that for a while already. The difference was that I was no longer compensating. And that revealed something important. Without my constant adjustment, small fractures began to show. Not conflicts, confusion. Moments where he'd pause mid-plan and ask, "You're okay with this, right?" I'd look at him calmly and say, "I'll think about it." I meant it. Those 3 words shifted the dynamic more than any argument ever could. They delayed momentum. They reintroduced uncertainty. And they did it without confrontation. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify the pause. I simply took back time. During this period, I started paying closer attention to the practical aspects of our life together. Not obsessively, methodically. I reviewed shared accounts, noted patterns, understood what was joint, what was assumed, and what was undocumented. This wasn't paranoia, it was literacy. I had always handled details, now I examined them. And the more I looked, the clearer the picture became. Not of betrayal or wrongdoing, but of imbalance. Of a structure built on my reliability and his autonomy. Of a system where I absorbed risk without holding leverage. Seeing that didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I kept notes, dates, conversations, decisions made without discussion. Not to build a case, but to build understanding. Memory is unreliable when you've spent years minimizing your own reactions. Documentation isn't. Still, outwardly, nothing changed. We went to dinner, we made small talk, we shared a bed. If anything, I became more composed, more neutral. He read it as contentment. That misunderstanding protected me, because when people believe they know your limits, they stop watching for movement. I wasn't plotting an exit. Not yet. I was simply reclaiming my position as an observer in my own life, learning where the weight actually sat, learning what would happen if I stopped holding everything together. And what happened was this. I realized how much power had been quietly resting in my hands all along. not because I'd seized it, but because it had been placed there through neglect. Silence, once a reflex, had become a tool, and I was learning how to use it. What they never noticed was how much I had already been trusted with. Not intentionally, not as an acknowledgement of authority, but because it was convenient. I knew where the documents were stored, both digital and physical. I knew which accounts were joint and which were temporary solutions that had somehow become permanent. I knew the rhythm of our finances, the cadence of spending and saving, the assumptions built into every month. I knew because I had been the one smoothing things over when numbers didn't quite align. For years, that knowledge had felt like a burden. Now, it felt like context. I didn't announce that I was paying attention differently. I simply stopped treating information as background noise. I started reading instead of skimming, comparing instead of assuming, asking myself questions I had previously outsourced to trust. Why is this structured this way? Who benefits from this arrangement? What would happen if I stepped back? I also noticed how often my name appeared on things without my input. Authorizations, shared obligations, responsibilities that relied on my consistency to remain invisible. It wasn't malicious, it was habitual, and habits once established are rarely re-examined. That realization stripped the situation of drama. There was no villain to confront, just a system that had evolved around my silence. I began organizing, not physically, but conceptually. I mapped out what I controlled, what I influenced, and what I had simply been maintaining out of inertia. I separated emotional responsibility from legal responsibility. They had been intertwined for so long that untangling them felt like learning a new language. I sought information quietly, not advice yet, just understanding. I read about shared assets, about default assumptions people make when they're fine for too long. I learned what questions mattered and which ones only created noise. All of this happened without a single confrontation. That's the part people often misunderstand. They imagine preparation as secrecy or deception. It wasn't. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you stop trying to preserve an image and start trying to understand reality. At the same time, I observed him more closely, not to judge, but to notice how he spoke about the future, how certain he sounded, how rarely he checked for alignment. His confidence wasn't cruel, it was comfort. He believed the structure was stable because it had always been. And he believed I was part of that stability, not a variable. I didn't correct that belief. There were moments when I could have, small openings where I could have said, "This doesn't work for me," but I didn't yet know how it didn't work. Only that something fundamental was misaligned. Speaking without clarity would have invited negotiation, not resolution, and I wasn't ready to negotiate myself smaller again. So I stayed quiet, not withdrawn, present, neutral, observant. I started to see how easily my calm was misinterpreted as agreement, how much weight silence carries when people are used to it from you, and how powerful it becomes when you're no longer using it to disappear. The most important thing I noticed was this: no one was watching me. Not really. They were watching outcomes, stability, continuity. As long as those remained intact, my internal state was irrelevant. That invisibility, once painful, became my shield. Because when people stop monitoring you, they stop anticipating change. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't even planning an exit yet. I was preparing for options, and options require information, not emotion. By the time anyone sensed something was off, it would already be too late to reframe it as a misunderstanding. The groundwork would be laid, not aggressively, not secretly, but thoroughly. That's what they never noticed. Not because they were careless, but because they had grown comfortable. And comfort is rarely alert. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline or a sense of victory. It arrived quietly, like a fact you've always known, suddenly arranging itself into a sentence. I was sitting alone at my desk one evening, a stack of documents open on my laptop. Nothing unusual: bank statements, account summaries, old emails I'd archived without thinking much about them at the time. I wasn't searching for proof of wrongdoing. I was looking for coherence. And then I saw it. Not a single mistake, not a secret, a pattern. Certain responsibilities flowed through me. Certain benefits flowed around me. I was central to the functioning of our shared life, but peripheral to its control. My name was attached to obligations that assumed permanence, while authority rested elsewhere. It wasn't malicious. That mattered to me. This wasn't about betrayal, it was about architecture. And architecture determines outcomes. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The structure of things explained every small cut, every unconsulted decision, every moment where my agreement had been assumed rather than earned. It explained why my silence had been so easy to mistake for consent. The reveal wasn't that I was being wronged, it was that I had been positioned. And positioning is rarely accidental. I felt no anger, just a strange calm, edged with clarity. Anger would have scattered my focus. Clarity sharpened it. I understood then why the idea of talking it out suddenly felt inadequate. You can't discuss your way out of a structure that doesn't recognize your agency. You have to change your position within it. That's when I stopped thinking in terms of fairness and started thinking in terms of alignment. What did I want my life to look like if I were fully represented in it? What would need to change for that to be possible? Which assumptions would have to be dismantled? Not emotionally, but practically. The answers were sobering. They required action, not explanation. I didn't share this realization with anyone. Not friends, not family, not him. I needed the insight to remain uncontaminated by opinions or urgency. This was mine, and it came with an unexpected gift, restraint. Knowing something privately gives you leverage, not because you can use it, but because you don't need to rush. There was no countdown, no ticking clock. I could move deliberately. I also understood something else, equally important. Nothing had to be dramatic to be decisive. The most irreversible shifts often happen in paperwork, not conversations. In timing, not tone. I closed my laptop that night without feeling overwhelmed. That surprised me. I had expected fear or sadness or even relief. Instead, I felt settled, as if I had finally been oriented correctly within my own life. Over the next few days, I let the realization sit. I observed how it reframed interactions I'd once found confusing. Why certain discussions never went anywhere. Why suggestions stalled, but decisions never did. Why did my role had felt essential but limited? I wasn't upset with my past self. She had done the best she could with the information she had. But now, the information had changed. And with it, my responsibility to act. Still, I didn't move yet. Revelation doesn't demand immediacy. It demands precision. I knew that whatever I chose next would need to be clean, irreversible, free of emotional static, not something that could be negotiated away or softened by reassurance. The reveal wasn't a call to confrontation. It was a call to decision. And once you hear that call clearly, there's no going back to pretending you didn't. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when you realize that indecision is no longer neutral. Before that moment, waiting feels responsible, measured, mature. You tell yourself you're gathering information, allowing emotions to settle, giving things time. But eventually, waiting becomes a choice in itself. And once you see that, you're already standing at the decision point. For me, that moment didn't come with urgency. It came with stillness. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed one morning, already dressed for work, shoes on, keys in hand, and feeling no pull toward the life I was about to step back into. Not resistance, not dread, just absence. As if something essential had quietly exited the room while everything else remained in place. That was when I understood. Nothing was going to happen to me anymore. Whatever came next would happen because of me, or not at all. Up until then, I had been considering options the way people often do in long relationships. Emotionally first. Could this be fixed? Was this just a phase? Was I being unfair? Was there a version of this life where I could speak up and be met halfway? I ran through those scenarios carefully, honestly. Not as fantasies, but as realistic projections. I imagined sitting him down and explaining what I'd realized. Naming the imbalance, asking for collaboration. I imagined his surprise, his defensiveness, his insistence that he never meant it that way. I imagined apologies, promises to do better, incremental change. And then I imagined the long tail of that path. The monitoring, the reminders, the subtle way responsibility would still default back to me, to teach, to correct, to wait. Even in the best version of that conversation, I would still be the one carrying the weight of recalibration. I imagined another path, staying silent, staying put, adjusting my expectations instead of the structure. I could make peace with less agency, focus on my own internal world, build a life within the limits instead of challenging them. That path was familiar, comfortable in its way, predictable, and deeply narrowing. There was also the most drastic option, the one people assume comes with panic or anger, but which arrived for me with surprising calm, the option of not trying to fix the structure at all, the option of stepping out of it. That possibility didn't feel like a loss. It felt like alignment. What stopped me wasn't fear. It was responsibility. I wanted to be certain I wasn't reacting, that I wasn't punishing him for a system we had both contributed to, that I wasn't abandoning something repairable simply because it required effort. So I gave myself time, not to hesitate, but to listen. I paid attention to my body, to how it responded when I imagined each future. One path tightened my chest, another dulled everything. The third, clean, decisive, unnamed, brought a quiet sense of rightness. Not excitement, not relief, clarity. That's when I understood something essential. I wasn't choosing against him. I was choosing for myself. And those two things only look like opposites when you've been living without full agency. The decision point isn't about action yet. It's about orientation. Once I oriented myself toward my own authorship, everything else rearranged around that truth. I stopped asking whether the relationship could be saved and started asking a different question. What would continuing require me to compromise that I'm no longer willing to? The answer was simple and non-negotiable. My voice, my consent, my capacity to shape my own life without asking permission for it. I realized then that any path requiring me to argue for those things was already misaligned. This wasn't an emotional decision. It was structural, philosophical even. I had outgrown the role I'd been placed in, and no amount of renegotiation could turn that role into something it was never designed to be. The most sobering part was accepting that this clarity didn't require his agreement. For a long time, I had believed that major decisions in a marriage needed mutual recognition to be valid. That felt fair, respectful. But fairness doesn't mean paralysis, and respect doesn't mean erasing yourself while waiting for someone else to catch up. I wasn't obligated to remain in a structure simply because it functioned. Once that settled, something unexpected happened. The urgency disappeared. I wasn't rushing toward an exit. I wasn't planning an announcement. I wasn't bracing for conflict. The decision, once made internally, created space instead of pressure. I knew what I was going to do, but more importantly, I knew how I would do it. Quietly, legally, with foresight instead of fallout. I also knew what I would not do. I would not threaten. I would not bargain. I would not try to be understood by someone who had benefited from not understanding me. This wasn't about blame. It was about alignment between my inner reality and my external life. The decision point marked the end of hoping something would change on its own. It marked the end of waiting for the structure to recognize me. From that moment on, every action I took would be oriented toward clean separation. Not just emotionally, but practically. Toward a future that didn't depend on someone else's willingness to adjust. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel broken. I felt resolved. And the resolution is quieter than people expect. It doesn't announce itself. It simply removes doubt. By the time I picked up my keys and left for work that morning, nothing had changed on the surface. But underneath, the decision had already been made. The rest was execution. Once the decision was made, my life entered a strange in-between state. Externally, everything looked the same. Internally, nothing was. This is the phase people rarely imagine correctly. They assume that once you decide to leave, emotionally or structurally, you become restless, volatile, eager to act. But the opposite happened to me. I became precise. Moving in silence doesn't mean secrecy. It means intention without announcement. I didn't pack bags. I didn't distance myself emotionally in obvious ways. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. I simply began aligning my actions with the future I had already chosen. The first thing I did was slow down time, not literally, but strategically. I stopped rushing decisions. I let conversations unfold without steering them toward reassurance. When he talked about plans, I listened without reinforcing them. I neither agreed nor objected. I let assumptions remain assumptions. That alone shifted more than he realized. I scheduled appointments during work hours, ordinary ones, administrative ones. Nothing that raised suspicion. I asked questions in neutral tones. I listened carefully to the answers. I confirmed details in writing. I learned which processes required notice, which required documentation, and which required nothing at all except timing. At home, I remained consistent, kind, even attentive, not because I was pretending, but because my behavior was no longer driven by fear of disruption. There's a steadiness that comes when you're no longer negotiating your own presence. He mistook that steadiness for peace, and I let him. I also became acutely aware of language, how much weight certain words carried, how often I'd previously said we when I meant you. I stopped doing that. I spoke only for myself. I'll need to think about that. I'm not sure yet. I'll let you know. Each sentence returned agency without confrontation. Each one subtly rewired expectations. No one panics when the ground shifts slowly. During this period, I made sure that nothing I did could be framed as impulsive. Everything had a paper trail. Everything followed the procedure, Everything was boring in the best possible way. There's power in boring. It disarms suspicion. It prevents narrative distortion. It keeps you anchored in facts when emotions eventually arrive. And I knew emotions would arrive, just not yet. The silence I moved in wasn't cold. It was neutral. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't punishing him with withdrawal. I was simply no longer compensating for the imbalance. I also paid attention to myself in a new way. Not introspectively, operationally. I noticed how my energy shifted when I imagined the next chapter, how my sleep deepened, how the low-grade ache I'd carried for years began to dissolve without explanation. That was confirmation enough. There were moments when I could have rushed, when impatience flickered, when I wanted a resolution instead of a process. But I reminded myself, rushing would give the situation a shape I didn't want. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to conclude. And conclusions, when handled properly, don't require spectacle. By the time everything was positioned quietly, thoroughly, there was nothing left to debate. No leverage to contest. No story to rewrite. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, the outcome was already inevitable. And inevitability, when it arrives without warning, is often mistaken for suddenness. It wasn't sudden. It was simply unseen. Consequences rarely announce themselves when they begin. They surface indirectly, through confusion rather than confrontation. Through small disruptions that don't yet have a name. At first, he noticed delays. Plans that once moved effortlessly now pause. Questions that used to resolve themselves lingered unanswered. Not because I refused to engage, but because I no longer absorbed momentum on his behalf. He would say things like, "I thought we'd already decided," and I would respond calmly, "I don't remember agreeing to that." Not defensively, not accusatory, just factual. That unsettled him. People who are used to continuity feel lost before they understand its source. They sense something slipping, but can't point to what. And because nothing had been said aloud, there was nothing to argue with. I watched this unfold with a strange detachment. Not satisfaction, awareness. The system was responding exactly as systems do when a stabilizing force quietly withdraws. At work, too, shifts became noticeable. Responsibilities that had once defaulted to me now required discussion. Approval loops slowed. Assumptions were challenged, not by protest, but by absence. People began asking more questions, not because I demanded it, but because they could no longer rely on my automatic compliance. At home, the change became harder to ignore. He grew restless, checked in more often, asked if everything was okay. I answered honestly, yes, because it was, for the first time in a long while, it was. What he meant, of course, was, "Are we okay?" And what I meant was, "I am." That distinction mattered. There was a night when he sat across from me at the table, scrolling through his phone, frowning slightly. "Something feels off," he said. "I can't put my finger on it." I looked at him and nodded. I felt that way for a while. It wasn't an accusation, it was an acknowledgement. He didn't press further. He wasn't ready to. Loss doesn't always arrive as grief. Sometimes it arrives as an inconvenience, as uncertainty, as the sudden realization that what you relied on is no longer self-sustaining. And because nothing dramatic had happened, there was no urgency to address it, no crisis to rally around, just a growing sense that the ground wasn't as solid as it used to be. Friends noticed it too, in subtle ways. Invitations were harder to coordinate. Decisions took longer. The dynamic had shifted, though no one could articulate how. I remained calm throughout. Not performatively so, genuinely. The anxiety that usually accompanies relational tension was absent. I wasn't waiting for reassurance or resolution. I was watching cause and effect unfold. The most telling moment came when he said, almost to himself, "I don't know why this feels harder all of a sudden." I did, because difficulty isn't always created by conflict. Sometimes it's created by equality. When you stop smoothing the path, others have to feel the terrain. The consequences weren't punitive. They were structural. The system was adjusting to a new variable, my autonomy, and that adjustment came with friction. I didn't rush to explain it away. I didn't rush to soothe. I let the discomfort exist, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for reality, because anything worth changing has to be felt before it can be understood. And this, finally, was being felt. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. That's the part people struggle with most. The idea that awareness can arrive after agency has left the room. They assume realization creates opportunity. Sometimes it only creates regret. The shift in him was gradual at first. Concern softened into attentiveness. attentiveness to effort. He asked more questions, listened longer, started phrasing things as invitations instead of conclusions. On the surface, it looked like an improvement, but timing matters. What he was responding to wasn't my pain. It was the absence of my accommodation. And by the time that absence registered, I had already moved past the need for validation. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when he tried to re-enter the space he'd long assumed was secure. We were walking after dinner, side by side, the way couples do when they're trying to reconnect without naming it. He reached for my hand. I let him take it. "I feel like I've missed something," he said, like I wasn't paying attention. I didn't pull away. I didn't confront him. I simply said, "I think that's true." That was the moment he realized the conversation wasn't about reassurance. From then on, his efforts intensified. He suggested counseling, asked what I needed, spoke in language that would have meant everything to me a year earlier. But need has a shelf life. When you've already met your own clarity, late empathy doesn't land as healing, it lands as confirmation. I listened, fully, respectfully. And I understood something that surprised even me. I wasn't moved. Not because he was insincere, but because he was finally responding to a version of me that no longer existed. The woman who needed to be seen had already seen herself. There's a particular sadness in realizing that someone can love you genuinely and still not know how to meet you in time, that they can care deeply and still benefit from your silence for too long. This wasn't about fault, it was about the sequence. He wanted to fix what he now understood. I had already restructured my life around the understanding he had just reached. When he asked, "Is it too late?" I didn't answer immediately. I considered the question carefully, not emotionally, but truthfully. Then I said, "For the kind of repair you're imagining, yes." I didn't say it with finality, I said it with accuracy. You can't rebuild a foundation after someone has already moved into a different house. What he was offering now required me to step back into the role of guide, to explain, to monitor, to wait, to invest emotional labor into someone else's awakening. That was the one thing I could no longer do. I had spent years being patient. I wasn't willing to spend one more explaining why patience had run out. The regret on his face wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, confused. He kept trying to locate the moment when things could have gone differently. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. There wasn't a single moment. There were hundreds, and each one had passed without comment. By the time he saw the pattern, I had already stepped out of it. There's no cruelty in that, just consequence. And consequences don't negotiate. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't resemble what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no emotional crescendo. It took place on a quiet afternoon, in a neutral space, with sunlight coming through the window and nothing dramatic in the air. That was intentional. By then, I understood that intensity would only give him something to react to. Calm left no room for deflection. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, not because I owed him an explanation, but because clarity deserves a clean setting. We sat across from each other. He looked tired, not from conflict, but from trying to reverse something that no longer had a handle. "I feel like I'm talking to someone who's already gone," he said. I nodded. "I am." There was no accusation in it, just a statement of fact. He asked when it happened, when I decided. I told him the truth, not a date, but a process. That it wasn't one event, but an accumulation. That nothing had snapped. It had simply settled. He tried to apologize again, not defensively this time, carefully, thoughtfully. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him. That confused him more than anything. "I'm not angry," I said, "and I don't need you to convince me you care. I know you do." He asked why that wasn't enough, and that was the only moment I paused. "Because care without awareness still asks me to do the work," I said. "And I'm done working to be included in my own life." The room went quiet. I could see him trying to find a counter-argument, something to negotiate, something to fix. But there was nothing to grab onto, no blame to dismantle, no emotional charge to diffuse. That's what calm does. It removes leverage. He asked if there was anything he could do now, anything at all. I considered it carefully, then answered honestly. "No," I said, "not without asking me to become someone I'm not anymore." That was the hardest part, for both of us. Accepting that change doesn't always look like improvement from the outside. Sometimes it just looks like separation. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't reclaiming power. I was honoring a boundary that had taken years to form. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors. We stood. We acknowledged the finality, and then we went our separate ways in the same calm manner we'd sat down. Later, I realized something important. Confrontation doesn't require heat to be effective. It requires clarity. Heat invites debate. Clarity ends it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. For the first time, I hadn't minimized myself to keep the peace. And the peace that followed was real, not performative. After everything was said, after decisions had names and endings had shapes, I expected a kind of emotional aftermath. Grief, maybe, or relief so sharp it felt like vertigo. What I felt instead was steadiness, not numbness, not euphoria, just a grounded sense of inhabiting my own life again. For a long time, my identity had been defined by function. What I could manage, maintain, absorb. I was known for my reliability, my calm, my ability to hold things together without asking for much in return. Those traits didn't disappear after the separation, but they were no longer the whole story. Now they belonged to me, not to a system that depended on my silence. I learned that being composed doesn't mean being available. That calm can coexist with boundaries. That strength isn't measured by how much you endure, but by how clearly you choose. My days became quieter in a different way. Less background noise, fewer assumptions to manage. I noticed how much mental space had been occupied by anticipating other people's needs. When that space cleared, something else moved in. Curiosity. I began making decisions without explaining them first. Small ones at first. How I spent my weekends, where I focused my energy, who I allowed access to my time. Each choice reinforced the same message. I am allowed to be central in my own life. People responded differently. Some were surprised by my decisiveness. Others misread it as withdrawal. A few assumed something must have happened to make me this way. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The truth was simpler. Nothing happened. I just stopped disappearing. I also learned to recognize early signals now. The subtle cues I once dismissed. When someone assumes rather than asks. When my calm is mistaken for consent. When reliability begins to replace reciprocity. I don't confront those moments aggressively. I name them calmly, or I step back. Both are forms of clarity. There's no bitterness in this version of me. No lingering desire to prove anything. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about authorship. About knowing where your influence ends and your responsibility begins. And here's what surprised me most. I didn't become harder. I became lighter, not because things are easy, but because they're aligned. When your actions match your internal reality, you expend less energy justifying yourself. I still value partnership. I still believe in shared life. But now I understand that mutuality isn't about harmony. It's about awareness. And awareness requires participation from both sides. I don't wait anymore for someone to notice me. I notice myself. And I trust that the right people will do the same, without needing reminders. This isn't a triumphant ending, it's a quiet one, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. Just space. There's a lesson people often try to extract from stories like this. Something clean and directive. Speak up sooner. Don't let things go on so long. Demand more. Those aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. What this experience taught me is quieter and harder to explain. Not all harm looks like cruelty. Some of it looks like comfort that slowly forgets to include you. Some of it looks like being trusted with everything except authorship. And because it doesn't bruise, it doesn't get named until you can no longer ignore its shape. I don't believe in rewriting the past with regret. The woman I was did what she knew how to do. She preserved stability. She believed patience would be met with awareness. That belief wasn't foolish. It was human. But patience without mutual attention becomes erasure. The turning point wasn't learning how to demand better treatment. It was learning how to stop participating in my own invisibility. How to listen to the quiet signals instead of overriding them with reason. How to recognize that calm doesn't obligate you to absorb everything without response. Quiet dominance isn't about winning, it's about alignment. About knowing when something no longer reflects who you are, and having the discipline to respond without spectacle. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't stay to teach. I didn't try to be understood by someone who benefited from not understanding me. I simply chose myself, thoroughly and without apology. And that choice didn't require noise. If there's a moral here, it's this. When your silence is mistaken for consent, the most powerful response isn't volume, it's clarity. When your presence is taken for granted, the most honest correction is absence. And when you realize that the life you're living was built without your full participation, you're allowed to step out of it without explaining why it took you so long. Some endings aren't explosive, they're conclusive. They don't ask to be witnessed. They just leave you standing in a life that finally fits. If you've been listening to this and recognizing yourself, not in the details, but in the pattern, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized you were being quietly erased, only after you stopped trying to hold everything together?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ